On a sunny spring afternoon in 1975, two sisters left their suburban Maryland home for a simple trip to get pizza and vanished without a trace. 12-year-old Sheila and 10-year-old Catherine Lyon were last seen laughing outside a busy shopping center, chatting with a man who claimed to be recording voices for a radio show. It was broad daylight. The plaza was full of people, and their neighborhood was the kind of place where children rode bikes freely and parents rarely worried. But by nightfall, the Lyon family was plunged into a nightmare that would span decades. What began as an ordinary outing soon became one of the most haunting missing children cases in American history, marked by false leads, a chilling ransom call, and a long-forgotten witness whose story, nearly 40 years later, would finally break the silence. This is the true story of innocence, lost a relentless pursuit of truth, and the secrets buried deep in the shadows of Taylor's Mountain. Thank you for choosing my video among thousands of videos out there to watch. Helping me with a subscription of yours is very small but very big and too valuable. March 25th, 1975 dawned bright and full of promise in Kensington, Maryland, a picture-perfect suburb just outside Washington, D.C. The air held the first real warmth of spring, and across the tree-lined streets of this peaceful neighborhood, children were waking up to a carefree day of spring break. In the Lyon family home on Pleers Mill Road, there was no sense that anything was amiss. The four children of John and Mary Lyon had a day of freedom ahead of them, and the household buzzed with the easy energy of a day without obligations. John, a popular local radio personality for WMAL, was already at work, his familiar voice filling the airwaves across the DC area. At home, Mary moved about the kitchen with practiced grace, preparing breakfast as her children shared their plans. Jay, the oldest at 15, was focused on basketball. He was heading to the local courts to meet up with friends, and 9-year-old Joseph eagerly tagged along, hoping to pick up some tips from his big brother. Meanwhile, the middle children, Sheila, age 12, and Catherine, 10, exchanged glances, already in sync with their own quiet agenda. They had their hearts set on a trip to Wheaton Plaza, the nearby shopping center that had become a popular destination for local kids. The sisters were excited not only by the idea of wandering through stores and window shopping the Easter displays, but also by the hint of independence that such a trip represented. As they chatted excitedly, Mary overheard and offered a suggestion that made their plan even better. Why not stop for pizza at the Orange Bowl, a treat both girls loved? Catherine laughed and joked about the rising price of a slice, and Mary handed them each $2, a generous allowance. By 1975, standards enough for lunch and perhaps a small treat. Her only rule was simple and clear: be home by 4 p.m., no exceptions. The girls readily agreed. They were dependable, and neither had ever given their parents reason to worry. At around 11:00 a.m., with the sun already warming the sidewalks, the Lyon children went their separate ways. Jay and Joseph headed toward the basketball courts, and Sheila and Catherine, dressed in casual spring clothes, began their short walk to Wheaton Plaza. Their home was less than a mile from the shopping center, and they knew every street and corner along the way. To anyone watching, the two sisters would have seemed like any other pair of suburban girls, carefree, chatty, full of life. The plaza itself was busy that Tuesday. Families, teens, and shoppers moved from store to store. It was a public, bustling place where danger seemed distant, almost inconceivable. Sometime before 1:00 p.m., the girls arrived and were spotted by a neighborhood boy sitting on a bench outside the Orange Bowl. With them was a man. He was tall, well-dressed, and looked completely out of place in terms of danger, clean-cut, wearing a brown suit, carrying a briefcase. His demeanor was friendly and confident. He introduced himself to the children as someone working for a radio station, explaining that he was collecting voices for a segment to air later. Inside his briefcase was a tape recorder and a microphone, cutting-edge equipment for the time and to young kids intriguing. Sheila and Catherine were especially drawn in. After all, their own father was in radio. This felt familiar, even fun. The man invited them to speak into the microphone, and several children joined in, thinking it was a chance to be heard on air. A bystander noted that the man walked with a slight limp, a small but memorable detail that would become critical decades later. At 2:00 p.m., their brother Jay arrived at Wheaton Plaza to buy a kite. Passing by the Orange Bowl, he glimpsed his sisters inside, sitting at a table eating pizza and talking animatedly. They looked happy and relaxed. He didn't interrupt, choosing instead to let them enjoy their independence. This sighting, seemingly insignificant at the time, would become the last confirmed moment where everything appeared normal. No fear, no signs of distress. Just two sisters having lunch on a spring afternoon. By 2:30 p.m., the girls were seen one final time, walking west along the street that led back toward their neighborhood. A family friend driving by noticed them walking side by side, chatting as they always did. There was no indication that anything was wrong. They were not running, not being followed, and gave no sign of concern. It was the last known sighting of Sheila and Catherine Lyon. At home, Mary was preparing fried chicken for dinner, glancing at the kitchen clock as the hour neared 4:00 p.m. The house was still unnaturally quiet. Normally, the girls would burst through the front door, laughing, their footsteps echoing across the hardwood floors. By 4:15 p.m., Mary began to worry. She told herself they might be lingering with friends, browsing one last store. But by 4:30 p.m., her concern had deepened into something else, a mother's instinct warning that something was wrong. When John came home, shortly after he found his wife, pale and tense by the phone, they had raised responsible children. Catherine and Sheila were not the kind to disobey curfews or disappear without telling anyone. At 7:00 p.m., the Lyons called the Montgomery County Police Department. A patrol officer took their report, explaining that most missing children turned up quickly. He assured them it was probably a misunderstanding. But something about this case felt different almost immediately. By 8:00 p.m., police expanded the response. Officers fanned out across the neighborhood. House-to-house searches began. Detectives knocked on doors, showed photos, and asked about any sightings of the girls. Search dogs were brought in and tracked the girls' scent to Wheaton Plaza. But after reaching the parking lot, the trail abruptly ended as if they had disappeared into thin air. As hours turned to days, the community joined the effort. Hundreds of volunteers combed fields, woods, and storm drains. Local businesses donated food and supplies. The entire region was galvanized by the mystery. Flyers with the girls' smiling faces were posted on utility poles, bulletin boards, and store windows. The response was massive, emotional, and urgent. A reward fund quickly reached $9,000. Yet, no trace of the girls was found. 10 days later, a phone call shook the Lyon household. A man, his voice disguised, claimed to have kidnapped the sisters. He demanded $10,000 for their safe return and provided detailed instructions for a drop-off. Police were skeptical, but couldn't take the risk. They placed only $11 in a briefcase made to look full, hoping to draw the caller out. The drop location was surveilled, but no one showed up. Later, the caller phoned again, angry, accusing the family of involving police. He ended the call without providing proof the girls were alive and never called back. What had started as a peaceful spring day had now become a nightmare without end. Weeks turned into months. Then years. The posters faded, the flyers were taken down, and the case turned cold. The Lyon family, once full of warmth and laughter, became defined by loss. And in Wheaton, Maryland, a generation of parents would never again let their children walk to the shopping center alone. The final known moments of Sheila and Catherine Lyon's lives unfolded in one of the busiest and most visible places in their community, Wheaton Plaza. Nestled among department stores, boutiques, and eateries, the shopping center was the suburban heart of Montgomery County, a familiar and seemingly safe hub where children, teenagers, and families gathered daily. By the time the girls arrived that Tuesday afternoon, the plaza was already bustling. They had just begun that thrilling transition from childhood into adolescence, and a visit to the shopping center without adult supervision was a small but meaningful taste of independence. They browsed Easter window displays, laughed together, and made their way to their favorite lunch spot, the Orange Bowl Pizzeria. It was there, just outside the restaurant, that a neighborhood boy saw them sitting on a bench. He recognized them immediately. Nearly everyone in the area knew who the Lyon sisters were. But what made the sighting memorable was the man sitting with them. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, and sharply dressed in a neat brown suit. His polished appearance stood out, not threatening, but unusual in this environment filled with casually dressed locals. He didn't look like someone lurking or out of place. In fact, he looked official, respectable, trustworthy. He carried a briefcase, which he opened to reveal a tape recorder with a microphone, an uncommon sight in 1975. The man was speaking with Sheila and Catherine, as well as a few other children who had gathered out of curiosity. He told them he was conducting a radio project, interviewing kids to use their voices on the air. His story sounded legitimate, especially to Sheila and Catherine. Their father was a radio personality, and they had grown up around recording equipment and radio lingo. To them, it must have felt like a fun coincidence, a man doing a radio project just like their dad. The girls smiled, laughed, and took turns speaking into the microphone. They were animated and excited, likely imagining their voices being broadcast for all to hear. For the neighborhood boy watching nearby, the scene didn't raise any red flags. The man didn't touch the girls or act in a visibly threatening way. He was simply talking and recording, encouraging the children to have fun with the idea. One small detail stuck with the boy, though the man walked with a slight limp. It was barely noticeable, but unusual enough to stay in his memory. At the time, it didn't seem important. But decades later, that limp would become one of the most significant clues in identifying the man in the brown suit. Around 2 p.m., their brother Jay stopped by the plaza to pick up a kite. He looked through the window of the orange bowl and saw his sisters sitting at a table. They looked completely normal, eating pizza, talking and laughing like any other day. There was no sign of fear or anxiety. Jay didn't approach them, respecting their space. It would be the last time anyone definitively saw the girls behaving as though everything was okay. They had eaten lunch. They had followed through with the plan. Whatever happened with the man and the microphone hadn't seemed to disturb them. They were still on track to be home before their 4 p.m. curfew. But then, without warning or trace, everything changed. The man who approached Sheila and Catherine Lyon that afternoon at Wheaton Plaza did not look like a predator. He didn't fit the image most people associate with danger. He was clean-shaven, wore a neatly pressed brown suit, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being listened to. He had a briefcase in one hand and a microphone in the other, which he used to draw in his young audience. To the casual observer, he might have looked like a traveling salesman, a businessman, or perhaps, as he claimed, a representative from a radio station. That's exactly what he told the children, that he worked in radio and was conducting an audio project. He said he was collecting the voices of children for a segment that would be aired later. It sounded innocent, even exciting. Who wouldn't want to be on the radio? Especially for kids like Sheila and Catherine, whose own father was a recognizable voice. In local broadcasting, the man's story would have felt both believable and intriguing. The fact that he carried real audio equipment, a tape recorder with a connected microphone, lent credibility to his claim. This wasn't just some guy telling stories. He had the tools to back it up. And in 1975, such equipment wasn't common. The man seemed to know how to work the crowd. Other children wandered over curious, and he invited them to speak into the microphone too. Some likely declined, but Sheila and Catherine took part willingly. They weren't naive, they were bright, polite, and raised in a close-knit family. But they had no reason to suspect danger. To them, this man wasn't a threat. He was just another adult doing something vaguely familiar. He wasn't hiding in the shadows or using force. He used charm, confidence, and something far more disarming, curiosity. What he understood and what the children didn't was that gaining trust was the first and most crucial step in predatory behavior. As the girls took turns speaking into the recorder, smiling and laughing. With other kids, the man kept control of the conversation. He was likely gathering more than voices, possibly observing who was alone, who was outgoing, who might be most easily persuaded to stay longer. His slight limp went unnoticed by most, but it would later be remembered by the neighborhood boy who saw him. It was one of the only physical identifiers left behind in a case that otherwise had almost no evidence. Though Sheila and Catherine would later be seen eating pizza inside the orange bowl, the encounter with the man in the suit remained the most important early interaction of that day. He had gained their trust, and perhaps in doing so, subtly influenced their decisions afterward. Whether he asked them to meet him later, offered them something else to record, or simply observed them long enough to plan his next move, no one knows for certain. But one thing is clear: that charming, well-dressed man with the microphone wasn't who he claimed to be. And his encounter with the Lyon sisters would soon become the focal point of one of the most haunting missing persons cases in American history. While the well-dressed man with the tape recorder occupied the attention of Sheila and Catherine Lyon, another individual was also present at Wheaton Plaza that same afternoon, one whose presence made people deeply uncomfortable. Witnesses described him as a stark contrast to the man in the suit. This second man was young, possibly in his late teens or early 20s. He had long, unkempt dark hair, stood about 5'11", and his face was marked with severe acne and scarring, particularly on his left cheek. His clothes were tattered, mismatched, and unclean, far from the polished appearance of the man with the briefcase. He wore what some identified as a Peter's jacket, a style associated with a certain rebellious subset of youth in the mid-70s. Everything about him suggested disorder, disinterest in grooming, and an outsider status. But what made him truly unsettling wasn't just his appearance, it was his behavior. Teen girls walking through the plaza noticed him almost immediately. He wasn't just passing by or minding his own business. He was following them. Not aggressively or openly, but deliberately, persistently. He maintained just enough distance to avoid confrontation, but was clearly shadowing their movements. When they glanced back, he didn't look away. He stared. His eyes were fixed, intense, predatory. He didn't blink or break eye contact, even when one of the girls tried to call him out. One teen, Danette Pyle, remembered the moment vividly. Frustrated and unnerved, she turned around and said sharply, "Why don't you take a picture? It'll last longer." The words were meant to shame him, to make him realize he was being obvious and inappropriate. But they had no effect. The man didn't react, didn't flinch. He simply continued watching, as if her challenge had never occurred. That kind of behavior wasn't just creepy, it was calculated. But what was most chilling came later. Danette noticed the same man watching Sheila and Catherine Lyon. The same stare, the same hovering presence. He was paying them the same unsettling attention he had just given her group. And while nothing seemed to happen at that moment, it was the first time anyone connected this second man with the sisters directly. At the time, police were focused almost entirely on the tape recorder man, the one with the convincing story, the direct interaction, and the last known dialogue with the girls. But over time, this second suspect began to appear in witness accounts with growing frequency. His presence was less obvious, but possibly more dangerous. He didn't talk to kids, didn't try to win them over. He watched, and his interest in young girls seemed far from casual. He was never identified by name in those early days, but the memory of his strange, unsettling stare stuck with witnesses for years. While the polished man with the limp had offered charm, this second figure radiated menace. What no one could determine was whether the two men were connected or if their simultaneous presence was a terrifying coincidence. But what became clear as the investigation deepened was that the girls were not alone at the plaza that day. They were being watched, perhaps even hunted. Sometime around 2:30 p.m., the final known sighting of Sheila and Catherine occurred. It was a brief, unremarkable moment on the surface, but it would become a haunting memory for years to come. A family friend passing by in a car saw the sisters walking westward along Drum Avenue, the same street that led back to their home. They were side by side, as always, chatting, looking relaxed. There was no indication of distress. They weren't running. They weren't being followed. They weren't looking over their shoulders or glancing nervously behind them. From all appearances, it looked like they had done exactly what they said they would: visited the plaza, grabbed some lunch, and were now heading home. But despite the normalcy of that moment, it would be the last time anyone could say with certainty where they were. After that brief glimpse, the girls disappeared. They never arrived home. They never made it through the front door to greet their mother, who was waiting with dinner plans and expectations of chatter about their afternoon. Whatever happened to them occurred in that narrow window between their last steps along a familiar road and the 4 o'clock curfew they never missed. No one saw anyone approach them. No screams were heard. No struggle was reported. And yet two girls vanished in daylight in a populated suburb just blocks from their home. The timeline tightened around this last sighting. It gave investigators a narrow frame in which to work, but also emphasized how quickly the girls had been taken or had vanished without a single witness seeing it happen. The mystery that had begun with laughter and pizza now took its darkest turn. With every hour that passed, it became increasingly clear Sheila and Catherine Lyon had not simply lost track of time. Something or someone had stopped them from ever coming home. Back at the Lyon family home on Players Mill Road, the afternoon passed peacefully, at least at first. Mary Lyon was in the kitchen preparing one of her family's favorite dinners, fried chicken. The comforting sounds of sizzling oil and clinking pans filled the air. But as the clock approached 4:00 p.m., she found herself glancing at it more often than usual. Sheila and Catherine had always been punctual. They were responsible girls, especially when given the rare privilege of walking to Wheaton Plaza on their own. Their curfew was clear, and they knew how important it was to follow it. Still, the house remained quiet. No slamming front door. No excited voices recounting stories from the shopping center. Just silence. At first, Mary brushed it off. Maybe the girls had run into friends or lost track of time. But by 4:15 p.m., she felt a gnawing unease. She moved through the house with deliberate motions, trying to calm herself with routine. She said the table stirred, the food peeked through the front window. Still no sign of them. By 4:30, Mary's concern turned into dread. She checked the time again and again, her movements growing tenser with each passing minute. At 5:00 p.m., the fried chicken remained untouched in the refrigerator. Mary wasn't hungry anymore. She began pacing between the kitchen and the front porch, her heart pounding harder with each round. Every possibility raced through her mind, Maybe the girls had taken a longer route home. Maybe they'd stopped somewhere unexpectedly. But nothing made sense. Sheila and Catherine wouldn't have risked worrying their mother. They had never done anything like this before. When John Lyon arrived home just after 6 p.m., he found his wife sitting by the telephone, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation. John didn't need convincing. He felt the fear immediately, a cold, hollow ache in his chest. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The girls hadn't just lost track of time. They were missing. At 7 p.m., the Lyons made the phone call that would change their lives forever. They contacted the Montgomery County Police Department to report Sheila and Catherine as missing. The officer on duty was professional and calm. He reassured the parents that most missing children cases resolved quickly. Kids showed up a few hours later with simple explanations. Maybe they had gone to a friend's house or gotten distracted. But John and Mary knew better. This wasn't like their daughters. They knew their habits, their personalities, their sense of responsibility, and something deep inside them, a parent's intuition sharpened by love and fear, told them that their daughters were not coming home tonight. The search had begun. Although the initial police reaction followed standard protocol, it quickly became clear that this case was not going to be a typical missing child report. By 8 p.m., just 1 hour after the report was filed, Montgomery County officers were already canvassing the neighborhood. Squad cars slowly rolled through nearby streets, lights off, scanning for any signs of movement. Detectives went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen the girls that day or if anything unusual had caught their attention. The search expanded fast. This wasn't just a routine call anymore. Something about the Lyons' quiet urgency, the girls' known reliability, and the eerie silence surrounding their disappearance set off alarm bells among the seasoned officers. Within hours, police brought in search dogs trained in scent tracking. The canines were given articles of clothing from Sheila and Catherine, then taken to Wheaton Plaza. Their noses led them directly to the shopping center, confirming what the family already knew, that the girls had arrived safely. But when the dogs reached the edge of the plaza's parking lot, the trail went cold. It didn't drift. It didn't veer off down a side street. It stopped, abruptly, as if the girls had stepped into a void. That chilling detail sent the investigation into overdrive. The theory that the girls had simply wandered off or gotten distracted began to dissolve. Something or someone had intercepted them between the last visual sighting and their journey home. The response swelled. Helicopters equipped with searchlights swept over nearby wooded areas. Officers in uniforms and plain clothes searched parks, storm drains, alleyways, and abandoned buildings. Volunteers poured in, neighbors, friends, strangers from nearby towns. They hung posters, passed out flyers, and joined coordinated ground searches that stretched late into the night. The community united in fear and hope. People left their porch lights on. Others kept phones beside their beds, praying for a call, a tip, a sign. But no one found anything. No clothing, no personal items. No one heard screams, no shattered window, no sound of struggle. It was as though the girls had been erased. Overnight, the case grew from a local concern to a regional alert. News outlets picked up the story. Radio stations including WMAL, where John worked, broadcast appeals for information. The Lyon sisters' faces appeared on TV screens and in newspapers across the DC area. By the next morning, Montgomery County Police had established a command center. Detectives coordinated with the FBI and other jurisdictions. This was now a major investigation, one of the most intensive in Maryland's history at the time. But as search grids were mapped and leads began trickling in, the core mystery remained. How could two children vanish in the middle of the afternoon from a crowded shopping center in one of America's safest communities without a single person seeing it happen? 10 agonizing days passed after Sheila and Catherine disappeared. The Lyon family lived in suspended time, every moment swallowed by silence and fear. They answered every phone call with trembling hands, hoping, praying it would be the girls. On April 4th, 1975, the phone finally rang again. Mary Lyon answered, her heart thudding. On the other end was a male voice she didn't recognize. Cold and emotionless, he said he had the girls. His demand was simple: $10,000 in cash for their safe return. No police, no tricks. If they cooperated, he claimed Sheila and Catherine would come home. The call sent shockwaves through the Lyon household and the Montgomery County Police Department. Investigators immediately took it seriously. The instructions were detailed and specific. The money was to be placed in a briefcase and left in a restroom stall at the Annapolis courthouse. The caller gave the exact stall, the time, and strict orders against involving law enforcement. But the police had no choice. They couldn't risk losing the only lead they had, but they also couldn't trust a man who refused to prove he had the girls. If this was real, the Lyons were dealing with a kidnapper. If it was a hoax, then someone was deliberately preying on their unimaginable grief. A plan was quickly set into motion. Instead of the full ransom, the briefcase was filled with just 11 $1 bills, arranged to look like a stack of thousands from a distance. The case was placed in the exact location specified, and the area was blanketed with plainclothes officers, surveillance teams, and hidden cameras. They waited. Time crawled by, but no one came for the briefcase. Hours later, the phone rang again. It was the same man, his voice now laced with fury. He claimed to have seen the police. He said the deal was off. He accused the Lyons of betraying the agreement. Then he hung up. No proof of life had ever been given. No more calls followed. The line fell silent and stayed that way. The Lyons were devastated. What had once been a flicker of hope was now another cruel twist in a nightmare that had no end. Was it a hoax? Had the caller really had their daughters? Or was it a predator taking pleasure in their suffering? Either way, the result was the same. The girls were still gone, and the one person who might have known their fate had disappeared into the ether. Following the failed ransom drop, the investigation exploded in scale. Law enforcement expanded their net across state lines. Tip lines stayed open around the clock, and leads came pouring in, some promising, most vague, many unverifiable. People from as far away as California claimed to have seen the girls. Psychics offered visions. Letters arrived with strange messages. Some callers admitted to knowing nothing, but wanted to be part of the case. Others simply craved attention. It was a storm of noise and desperation. In the first 2 months alone, investigators logged thousands of tips and conducted hundreds of interviews. Local authorities were soon joined by federal agents and state police. They combed through criminal records looking for anyone with a history of child abduction, sexual offenses, or violent behavior within a multi-state radius. Sketch artists worked from witness descriptions to develop composites of both the tape recorder man and the younger scarred suspect. The drawings were distributed widely. News outlets kept the story alive. Still, no suspects were identified with certainty. No one stepped forward with the crucial breakthrough. The community continued to respond with extraordinary commitment. A network of CB radio operators, mostly truckers and hobbyists, formed a grassroots surveillance system across Maryland and neighboring states. They used their radios to report sightings of suspicious vehicles, girls matching the lion's description, or men resembling the suspects. They spent hours patrolling highways, parking lots, and rest areas. They found nothing. In May 1975, nearly 2 months after the girls vanished, Maryland's Lieutenant Governor, Blair Lee, made an extraordinary decision. He authorized the deployment of 122 National Guardsmen to search the region's wooded and undeveloped areas. These weren't just volunteers. They were trained personnel using grid-based tactics and specialized equipment to cover thousands of acres. They searched ravines, old wells, abandoned buildings, and storm drains. They used metal detectors, dogs, and probes to detect disturbed soil. It was one of the largest search operations in Maryland's history. But the results were heartbreakingly familiar. No signs, no items, no bodies. The case, despite its national attention, yielded no clear answers. By the end of the summer, investigators had to face a grim reality. They had done nearly everything possible with the tools and knowledge of the time. And yet Sheila and Catherine had vanished into a void. No crime scene. No eyewitness to an abduction. No confirmed suspect. Just a long winding trail of hopes dashed and families left broken. The search never truly stopped, but by the fall of 1975, the case began to fade from headlines. The Lyon family was left in a limbo worse than mourning. Without a body, without closure, they couldn't even grieve. Their daughters had become ghosts seen once, on a sunny afternoon, then never again. In the chaos of the early investigation, with media pressure mounting and tips flooding in from across the country, law enforcement had little time to sift carefully through every claim. Desperate families like the Lyons watched as their tragedy became the center of national attention. But even in that whirlwind, a critical moment slipped through the cracks. On April 1st, 1975, just 1 week after Sheila and Catherine vanished, a young man named Lloyd Lee Welch Jr., then 18 years old, approached Montgomery County Police with a startling claim. He said he had seen something important. According to Welch, he had been at Wheaton Plaza on the day of the girl's disappearance. He claimed to have witnessed a man whom he described as similar to the composite sketch later associated with the tape recorder man forcing 2 young girls into a red Camaro in the parking lot. Welch said the girls looked frightened and were struggling. He insisted he had seen an abduction take place. On the surface, it was exactly the kind of break investigators needed. A potential eyewitness, a specific vehicle, a direct account of what could have been the moment everything went wrong. But police, trained to be skeptical and already dealing with false leads by the dozen, pushed for verification. Welch agreed to take a polygraph test. When the results came back, they were damning. He failed. Every physiological indicator, heart rate, breathing, perspiration, spiked at the wrong moments. Investigators concluded he was lying. To them, he was just another attention seeker hoping for the 9,000 reward the family had offered for useful information. There was no way to verify his story, no corroborating evidence, and now a failed lie detector test. He was dismissed. His brief interview was reduced to a single page in the case file. Across the top, it was stamped, "Polygraph lied." That one piece of paper would sit untouched for nearly 4 decades. What the investigators didn't realize at the time was that Lloyd Welch wasn't just some random teen desperate for attention. He had a long and disturbing history of violent and sexually predatory behavior. His criminal record would eventually span multiple states, with charges ranging from assault to child molestation. But in 1975, he was brushed aside, forgotten. His name disappeared from the suspect list. The red Camaro he mentioned was never found, and no serious attempt was made to follow up on his claim. It was a critical mistake, one that would haunt the case for years, because Lloyd Welch wasn't lying for attention. He hadn't fabricated the story out of thin air. He knew something, and buried beneath his deception, fear, and self-preservation was a horrifying truth that no one had yet uncovered. By 2013, the case of Sheila and Catherine Lyon had become a ghost story told in Montgomery County. It had been 38 years since the girls disappeared. The original investigators had either retired or passed away. The once vibrant search efforts had faded into memory. The flyers were long gone. The reward fund closed. Most people believed the case would never be solved. The Lyons themselves, John and Mary, had grown old, still waiting for answers, still wondering every day what had happened to their daughters on that ordinary spring afternoon. Then everything changed. Montgomery County Police decided to reopen the case as part of a renewed focus on cold cases involving children. The file had grown to thousands of pages, spread across multiple boxes, witness statements, maps, sketches, suspect lists, false leads. The job of reviewing it fell to Sergeant Chris Homrock, a veteran detective known for his meticulous attention to detail and dogged pursuit of forgotten truths. He wasn't deterred by the passage of time. He believed old cases didn't die, they just waited to be looked at the right way. Homrock began the slow, deliberate task of going through every page. He didn't skip over dead ends or dismiss unreliable witnesses. Every note, every scribbled margin, every police report mattered. That's when he found it, a single-page statement from April 1st, 1975. It detailed an interview with an 18-year-old named Lloyd Lee Welch Jr., who had claimed to witness the girl's abduction. The page was marked with the now infamous note, "Polygraph lied." But something about the account caught Homrock's eye, details that seemed too specific to be invented, the kind of information someone wouldn't know unless they had actually been there. Then came the breakthrough. Homrock located a 1977 mugshot of Lloyd Welch. When he placed it next to the composite sketch created in 1975 of the younger, scruffier suspect, the one with the intense stare and acne-scarred face, the resemblance was unmistakable. The hair, the jawline, the eyes. The match wasn't exact, but it was close enough to ignite alarm bells. Digging deeper into Welch's background, Homrock was stunned by what he found. Welch had since become a convicted child molester, serving a 29-year sentence in Delaware for abusing a young girl. His criminal history stretched across multiple states and revealed a long-standing pattern of predatory behavior. Even more disturbingly, Welch was known to use props, metal detectors, cameras, and tape recorders to lure children, echoing the very tactic used by the mysterious man at Wheaton Plaza. For nearly 40 years, Welch had been hiding in plain sight. Dismissed, forgotten. Now he was at the center of the most notorious missing persons case in Maryland's history. In October 2013, Sergeant Homrock and his team traveled to Smyrna Correctional Center in Delaware to meet the man who had once walked into a police station with a story no one believed. As they entered the interview room, Welch looked up and calmly said, "I know why you're here. You're here about those two missing kids." And with those words, a case frozen in time suddenly came alive again. When detectives sat across from Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. in October 2013 at Smyrna Correctional Center, they weren't sure what to expect. He had been sitting on the periphery of the investigation for nearly 4 decades, dismissed as a liar, branded as a failed witness. But now older, imprisoned, and with nothing left to lose, Welch seemed oddly composed. His first words said it all. "I know why you're here. You're here about those two missing kids." That opening sentence sent a chill through the room. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't curious. It was resigned and pointed. He knew the case. He remembered the girls. And he seemed ready to talk. The detectives approached the interview with caution. After all, Welch was a career criminal with a long history of manipulation. They didn't expect a full confession, but they wanted to hear what he had to say. Slowly, piece by piece, Welch began offering details, just enough to keep the conversation going. He confirmed that he had in fact been at Wheaton Plaza on March 25, 1975. He claimed to have seen two girls matching Catherine and Sheila's descriptions. He also mentioned seeing a man with a tape recorder, describing him vaguely as if unsure of whether to claim that role himself. But then, the story shifted. Welch began to admit he had not just witnessed events, he had been part of them. Over the course of 13 separate interviews, detectives chipped away at his resistance. What emerged was a chilling confession that unfolded like a horror story told in fragments. He admitted he had helped transport the girls. He suggested he had taken them to a location in Virginia. He eventually acknowledged helping dispose of their remains. He claimed he didn't kill the girls, but that he had been present during the aftermath. He said he had helped burn the bodies. He spoke of duffel bags, of a long burning fire, and of a remote mountain property where it all ended. As horrifying as these details were, they aligned closely with things no one outside the investigation would have known. The interview team understood immediately Welch wasn't just recycling rumors. He had insider knowledge. He'd been there, and as the questioning deepened, so did the story. Welch wasn't alone in this crime. He hadn't acted in isolation. The terror that descended on the Lyon family in 1975 wasn't the work of one twisted man. It was part of something far more sinister, a network, a conspiracy, a family legacy of violence. As the interviews progressed, Lloyd Welch's story began to morph. His initial implication that he was a frightened bystander gave way to darker admissions. He wasn't just present after the fact. He had delivered the girls to people he knew, and the names he started to provide were both familiar and terrifying. He implicated his uncle, Richard Allen Welch, and his father, Lloyd Welch Sr., in what had happened to Sheila and Catherine. According to Lloyd Jr., it was his relatives, not him, who had kidnapped, abused, and ultimately murdered the girls. He claimed the girls were taken from Wheaton Plaza to a location owned or controlled by his family, a concrete basement secured with a padlock where they were held against their will. What happened there was unspeakable. Lloyd Jr. described prolonged abuse, the kind of horrifying ordeal that confirmed what investigators had feared for decades. He said he had seen his uncle and father sexually assault the girls. He insisted he was not a willing participant, but his story shifted too many times to believe he was innocent. In some versions, he watched from the shadows. In others, he helped clean up. Sometimes he suggested he was threatened. Other times he came dangerously close to admitting active involvement, only to recoil and revise his words moments later. To experienced detectives, the pattern was familiar. A man testing the limits of what he could admit while still shifting the worst of the blame to others. But even if Lloyd Welch Jr. wasn't telling the whole truth, the details he gave were specific, disturbing, and increasingly credible. He described the aftermath of the murders in grim detail, blood-fire secrecy, and a code of silence within his family. He mentioned Taylor's Mountain in Bedford County, Virginia, a remote and rugged property tied to the Welch clan, that he said was where the girls were ultimately taken to be destroyed, burned beyond recognition in a fire that lasted for days. And chillingly, other family members would later confirm parts of the story. Welch's cousin, Henry Parker, and his sister Connie remembered him arriving with bloody duffel bags, the sickening stench of rot clinging to his clothes. They recalled fires. They remembered being told not to ask questions. The signs had been there. They had simply been ignored or buried in shame and fear. As investigators dug into the Welch family's history, what emerged was a multi-generational web of violence, secrets, and abuse. The disappearance of Sheila and Catherine Lyon wasn't just a horrifying crime. It was the visible tip of a deep, festering wound in a family that had hidden monstrous acts behind locked doors for years. Now, with Lloyd Welch Jr.'s confessions, the investigators finally had a trail to follow, one that led straight into the dark heart of a family where innocence was never safe. In September 2014, armed with a search warrant and bolstered by months of increasingly detailed interviews with Lloyd Welch Jr., investigators descended on a small, unassuming property in Hyattsville, Maryland, once home to Welch's uncle, Richard Allen Welch. The address had appeared in Lloyd's interviews as the location where Sheila and Catherine Lyon were held, abused, and possibly killed. For nearly 4 decades, the property had stood quietly in a suburban neighborhood, giving no hint of the horrors that may have unfolded within. Now, it became the center of a renewed forensic effort. The key detail Lloyd had provided was disturbingly specific. A concrete basement accessible by a single entrance, padlocked from the outside, where the two girls had been imprisoned. As investigators moved through the house, the interior was worn but not suspicious. Then they reached the basement and immediately their breath caught. It was exactly as Lloyd had described. A narrow stairway led down to a windowless concrete-lined room. The air was stale, the atmosphere was oppressive, and the space felt profoundly wrong. Crime scene technicians began scanning the walls and floors with luminol, a chemical that reacts with trace amounts of blood. The results were chilling. As the lights dimmed and the chemical sprayed bloody smears, lit up along the concrete surfaces, not just on the floor, but on the walls and even the ceiling. It wasn't a few drops. It was a scene of extreme violence, preserved beneath years of dust and neglect. The bloodstains followed the exact layout Welch had described, including areas where he said he had watched his relatives abuse the girls. Forensic experts collected samples and began DNA testing, but the timeline presented major challenges. The stains were nearly 40 years old. The material had degraded to the point where usable DNA was unlikely. Still, the pattern and location matched Welch's confession with eerie precision. It was no longer just his word, it was physical evidence. The basement wasn't just a story. It was real, and something terrible had happened there. This discovery marked a turning point in the investigation. It was the first hard evidence to support Welch's shifting narrative, and it made one thing clear: he hadn't made it up. Whether he had killed the girls or simply helped cover up the crime, he had been to this basement, and this was where their suffering began. With the basement discovery confirming the first half of Lloyd Welch's account, investigators turned to the second: the disposal. Welch had described a place called Taylor's Mountain, a secluded stretch of land in Bedford County, Virginia, where his extended family had lived and gathered for years. According to Welch, this was where the girls' remains were taken, stuffed into duffel bags, transported across state lines, and burned in a fire that raged for days. It sounded grotesque, almost unbelievable. But as the story unfolded, it became clear Welch wasn't the only one who remembered those events. His cousin Henry Parker finally came forward after nearly 4 decades of silence. He remembered that day in 1975 with disturbing clarity. Welch had arrived at the family property with 2 military-style duffel bags in the back of his vehicle. Parker recalled the moment the stench hit him, thick, rotting, unmistakable. Something was inside those bags, something dead. Welch never said what it was, but the implication was enough. The bags were thrown onto a fire that had already been burning. Parker didn't ask questions. He didn't want to know. But in his memory, the fire lasted much longer than normal, multiple days, with neighbors complaining about the smell. Other family members backed up parts of this account. Connie Welch, Akers Lloyd's sister, recalled seeing blood-soaked clothing Welch had asked her to help wash. She refused. She remembered the stench too, and the green duffel bag Welch had said contained spoiled beef. Now, with a specific location in mind, a multi-agency search team arrived at Taylor's Mountain. The terrain was rugged, overgrown, and spread across acres of family-owned land. Using ground-penetrating radar cadaver dogs and excavation equipment, the team began one of the most exhaustive forensic searches in the state's history. They followed Welch's guidance, marked off burn sites, and began digging. What they found would horrify even the most seasoned investigators. Buried beneath layers of charred earth and ash, search teams uncovered degraded human remains. The finds were small bone fragments, some teeth bits of wire believed to be from eyeglasses, and melted beads resembling the kind of jewelry young girls might wear. Scattered among the remains were objects so damaged by fire that even basic identification was difficult. Every item was handled with the utmost care and sent for testing. But the passage of time had done its worst. The heat of the fire, the decades of exposure, and the decomposition had erased any hope of definitive identification. DNA testing was attempted on the bone fragments, but results were inconclusive. There wasn't enough viable genetic material to confirm the remains belonged to Sheila and Catherine. The objects, the beads, the possible eyeglass wires could not be tied to the girls with certainty either. It was a devastating blow. Investigators had found the physical evidence of a brutal disposal, likely the final stage of the girls' journey. But they couldn't prove it beyond doubt. Still, the context was overwhelming. A suspect with direct knowledge, witnesses confirming his presence, a match between his description and physical evidence found in multiple states. All signs pointed to the tragic truth: Sheila and Catherine had died here and their bodies had been reduced to ash on Taylor's Mountain. Though the physical evidence couldn't shout the girls' names from the earth, it whispered their story. And for detectives, prosecutors, and a grieving family, it was finally enough to act. By 2017, after years of renewed investigation, a growing body of witness testimony, damning forensic evidence, and multiple confessions, Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. was finally held accountable. On September 12, 2017, inside a courtroom in Bedford County, Virginia, Welch, now in his 60s, gray-haired and aging behind bars, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree felony murder in connection with the disappearance and presumed deaths of Sheila and Catherine Lyon. The plea came 42 years and 5 months after the girls vanished from Wheaton Plaza. It marked the end of one of the longest unsolved child abduction cases in American history. For the Lyon family, who had waited through decades of anguish, false leads, and dead ends, it was a moment of solemn justice. They were there in court to witness it, John and Mary Lyon, now elderly, sitting silently as the man who had stolen their daughters' lives finally admitted, in legal terms at least, to his role in the crime. But even in confession, Welch held back. He denied direct involvement in the abuse or murder of the girls. According to the terms of his plea, he acknowledged that the murders occurred during the commission of felony crimes, specifically abduction with intent to defile, and that he had played a key role in transporting, concealing, and disposing of the bodies. He refused, however, to say who had actually ended the girls' lives. The court sentenced Welch to 2 concurrent 48-year sentences, effectively ensuring he would die in prison. Given his age and his pre-existing prison term in Delaware for unrelated child molestation charges, there was no realistic path to freedom. Still, Welch never apologized, never showed remorse, and never offered additional names or details beyond what he had already given. His silence left haunting gap spaces where the truth could not reach. Prosecutors accepted the deal, knowing a trial might not produce stronger results. Without recovered remains, and with decades of decay, weakening the forensic evidence, conviction through jury trial carried risk. The plea, while imperfect, secured accountability, confirmed key facts, and ended the legal limbo that had hovered over the Lyon case for over 4 decades. For the public, it was justice not complete but real. For the Lyon family, it was a bittersweet ending to a lifelong search for answers. Though Welch's conviction closed one chapter, many questions were left unanswered, and many participants likely walked free. Chief among them was Richard Allen Welch, Lloyd's uncle, and one of the 2 men he repeatedly implicated as having directly committed the abuse and murders in the concrete basement. Despite Lloyd Jr.'s repeated accusations and corroborating witness accounts, prosecutors determined that there wasn't enough admissible evidence to charge Richard Welch. No DNA, no fingerprints, no direct eyewitness placing him at the scene. The most damning information came from Lloyd Jr., a convicted felon child molester and admitted liar, hardly a reliable sole source. Prosecutors feared that relying too heavily on Welch's word without solid forensic backing would lead to a failed prosecution, or worse, a not guilty verdict that could never be reversed. Other family members, too, emerged as potential accomplices or accessories after the fact. Witnesses described seeing suspicious bags, being asked to clean bloody clothes, and watching long burning fires with no explanation. Some knew something. Others may have actively helped to cover it up. But decades had passed. Memories faded. Witnesses died. Evidence vanished. And with that, justice for the full scope of this conspiracy slipped just out of reach. The case raised dark questions about intergenerational abuse and the silence that surrounds it. Was the murder of Sheila and Catherine Lyon part of a larger pattern of familial predation? Were others complicit in keeping the truth buried? To this day, some within the Welch family maintain that more people were involved and that a broader conspiracy allowed the crime to remain hidden for decades. But with key figures either deceased or protected by lack of evidence, those questions may never be answered. More than anything, the absence of the girls' remains continues to haunt their family. Despite the searches at Taylor's Mountain, despite the charred bone fragments and degraded jewelry, there has never been conclusive proof that Sheila and Catherine's bodies were found. There were no funeral services, no headstones, no graves to visit. For John and Mary Lyon, now in their 80s, this has been perhaps the cruelest outcome of all. No place to mourn, no physical closure, only the ache of absence. Still, the impact of their story endures. The Lyon sisters' case fundamentally changed how America viewed child safety. In 1975, the idea that 2 children could vanish in broad daylight from a crowded shopping center was unthinkable. After their disappearance, parents watched more closely. Stranger danger entered the national vocabulary, and police procedures for handling child abductions began to evolve. Their case helped pave the way for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and contributed to the development of Amber Alerts, child safety education, and missing persons databases. The case also left a permanent imprint on the communities of Maryland and Virginia. For the people of Wheaton, it was the day innocence died. For generations of families, it became the reason children no longer walk to the mall alone. And for law enforcement, it became a case study in both the dangers of prematurely dismissing witnesses and the power of never giving up. When Lloyd Welch was finally brought to justice, John Lyon simply said, "We just want to say thank you. It's been a long time." It had been more than 4 decades of waiting, wondering, and grieving. They got answers, but never their daughters. Sheila and Catherine Lyon were just little girls laughing over pizza, excited about Easter displays, when they crossed paths with evil. Their story is no longer just a cold case. It is a warning, a tragedy, and a testament to the relentless pursuit of truth, even when it takes a lifetime to find it. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Your support truly means the world to me. If this video brought you value or resonated with you in any way, feel free to leave a little comment or hit subscribe so we can keep sharing more moments together. See you in the next one.